Okay, great. So last week, I laid out the general theme for this season's class, the general tension, what it is we're going to be looking at. Uh, we saw two sources on two opposing sides of the argument, enmity versus comity. Um, when is it that our friends and family take priority over our religious commitments? And when is it that our friends and family have to take a back seat to our religious commitments and the relationship with God or with Judaism becomes what is primary? That's what we're going to be looking at throughout this class. Uh, and you saw two sources, right, that seem to advocate for both positions. First, from uh, the Bible, were pretty clear and pretty strict about religious priorities coming first, warning us about the potential influence of our families, which could, let's say, steer us away from the right path. And then we saw two sources that suggested that there was room for compromise, that family and friends actually usually are there to help steer us on the right track, and we should listen to them more and keep those relationships strong. And then we had this fascinating story from the second book of Kings that actually provoked some really interesting discussion in the post class session, which we're going to do today too, by the way. We'll take some time at the end of the class just to talk about the sources we've been looking at, more interactive discussion with the recording setting off. But it provokes some really interesting discussion. Why is it that Elisha the prophet gave this allowance to Naaman to enter into a foreign temple? And what exactly the parameters were of that flexibility, and whether today Elisha, if he was a rabbi, might have given different advice than he did in the time when he was living. So today we're going to advance forward from the biblical period and look at a tractate of the Mishnah that some of you who took my class last fall will find familiar. We're going to look at a tractate of the Mishnah called Tractate Damai. Now, if you remember all of our discussions about the tithing and the truma offering and the heave offering and the second tithe and the first tithe, you remember it got pretty complicated. We're not going to need to get as into detail in today's class. But I do want us to recall, before we delve into the sources, the general idea of that Mishnah and what it is, that word damai. Damai, by the way, probably comes from Aramaic da mai, which means this, what is it? um, Damai is produce, and we don't know yet if it has been tithed. So this is what's really interesting about this tractate and what makes it very fitting or interesting to study with regards to this topic, right? The influence of our families and how much are we strict and how much are we not strict. Remember that in the rabbinic world, um, they they talk about the time when Jews were living in the land of Israel and all of the laws that they had to observe. One of the important laws, the laws of tithing your produce. Remember that the Levites, this all comes back to the idea that the Levites were not given an inheritance of their own in the land of Israel. You know that, right? All the tribes had land, but the Levites did not. The Levites means the priests and the Levites themselves. They lived off of the tithings. They lived off of the separations that all the other landholders uh, would be required to separate from their produce. That's how the Levites survived. So these laws were very, very important to the proper functioning of society. Now, remember, the key thing you have to know, just to refresh your memories for those of you who were here last year. What happens to you if you eat produce that was not tithed? Okay? Excommunication. Very, very bad. If you eat untithed produce, you failed to provide to the priests what was due to them. And in the rabbinic mind, if you denied the priests what was owed to them, it was like you were denying God what was due to God, because the priests are the one who dedicate their lives to God's service. So when you're not giving them of your bounty, you're starving them. You're starving God's service. So you are cut off from community, and it is a very, very serious transgression. Anyone who is caught eating untithed produce. Now remember, there are different tithes. The first tithe, the truma offering, goes to always the Kohanim. That goes to the priests. Okay? That's the one that's very, very serious. There was a second tithe as well, and that tithe called Ma'aser Rishon, the first tithe, that goes to the Levites. Okay? Then there was a third tithe called Ma'aser Sheni. So there's Truma, goes to the priests. Ma'aser Rishon goes to the Levites. Then there's Ma'aser Sheni, the second tithe. It's actually, if you think about it, it's the third. But remember, that tithe goes to, anyone remember? To, in certain years it goes for the poor, and in certain years it has to be eaten in Jerusalem. It was used sort of to help with the pilgrimage. So when you would go to the pilgrimage, you'd have this money to spend. It's like you were saving up for your trip to Jerusalem every couple of years. So you'd use that money to spend when you were in Jerusalem. Now, we know from history, actually the priest John Hyrcanus, whose writings we have, he writes about what the problem was in the Second Temple period with tithing. Most people observed the first tithe. Very easy, 10%. It's easy to calculate what that is. And with this tithe, they also were able to alleviate any worry of the severe punishment of being excommunicated and cut off, right? So because the punishment was very strict for not observing that first, what's called the truma or the heave offering, that first tithe, the punishment was very strict, so people were careful to observe it. With the second and the third tithe, it was much more loose. The punishment wasn't as strict. You know, it's like I say to you, save some money every year, put it in your RRSP to save up for your trip to Jerusalem every second to third year. Well, then your roof breaks and you have to take some money from there, and you have a flat tire and different expenses come up. And since there's no big punishment for taking from the second and the third tithe, you borrowed money from that account that you really weren't supposed to borrow money from. So in this world, we have rules that apply to two different kinds of Jews. Maybe this will refresh your memory. There are those who are called chaverim, friends. If you're in the group of friends, this is during the Second Temple, right? Then when I go and eat at your house, I'm not worried about tithing. I know that you know the rules. You're not going to dip into your tithe fund to fix your roof. because you know that these rules are important and you're going to observe them if you're a chaver. But remember the other word we learned for everybody else? They're called am haaretz. Am haaretz, think of it as saying regular folk. Regular folk who are just farmers and maybe not in the elite rabbinic class. They were not to be as trusted when it came to the separation of the tithes. And so their produce is considered to be damai. Damai. What is it? In other words, is this produce that I'm permitted to eat because I trust that they separated the tithe? Or am I not allowed to eat this produce because I'm not sure if this simple Jew actually did what he was supposed to do? If you are someone who's concerned with your primary relationship being God, right? If you're somebody who's really religious, you're going to be careful eating at the home of Anam Haaretz. That's what makes this tractate really interesting to study with regards to this topic. We think that the problems of whose house do I eat at and whose kashrut is acceptable to me, whose Jewish practice is one I can share, and whose is one that I have to distance myself from. We think that's a modern problem that only came about after the Enlightenment, in the modern uh, Jewish context, right? But it doesn't. It goes back 2,000 years. These problems existed even in the times of the Second Temple, where some were more trusted than others were. And yet, it could all be in one family, as we're going to see from the sources. One could be your brother, one could be your sister. So, how do you get along with each other when one of you might be a chaver and another one might be an am haaretz? So that's what I wanted to sort of set up before we delve into these sources in Damai, so that you all understand what it is we're dealing with. Produce where there are questions about whether it has been tithed correctly or not. And if you're somebody who's trying to live up to the letter of the law, you're going to be worried about Damai. So actually, the general rule, and this is important, so follow me. The general rule when it comes to Damai, if I stumble on produce and I have questions about whether it's been tithed or not, the general rule is assume that the person gave the first tithe. Assume that it was already separated out. Because as I said, most Jews were careful about the first tithe, even the simple am haaretz, because they were worried about that severe penalty with regards to the first 10% that they separated out. But you still had to separate additional portions, those additional portions, because you would not trust that an am haaretz was as careful with regards to those maaser rishon and maaser sheni, the second and the third tithe, you might call them. They were not going to be as careful about. Everyone understands? So you have an obligation when you have a certain amount of produce that is damai. In other words, you don't know what happened to it. You don't know who made it. You don't know, you're not sure that the proper tithes have been taken. You have a responsibility to tithe it yourself, right? Not as much as you might think, but still something. Okay, everyone's with me? It's not as important that you know all the details, but I just want you to get it into your head, right? This idea of tithing produce and how important that is. It's almost as if I would say in the modern context, you're not allowed to use any money that you make until you have apportioned a certain percentage of it and given it to charity. Think about it that way. if you're using money that you haven't yet taken that whatever percentage of it, you haven't taken that percentage out of it to give it to the poor, it's like you're stealing from them when you're using it to buy, I don't know, something fancy for yourself. Okay, so now let's delve into the sources. I'm going to share my screen with you so you can see these particular Mishnahs that we're going to learn from Tractate Damai. There's a whole tractate of the Mishnah that is solely devoted to questionable produce. Okay, can everyone see my screen? Can you give me a thumbs up if you can see my screen? Okay. Florence, would you be able to unmute yourself?
Yeah.
Okay, there we go. So
am I unmuted now?
Yes, you are. I hear you loud and clear. You're going to read for us the first source that we're going to study from Tractate Damai, just in the English.
Where it says Mishnah Damai?
You got it. Mishnah Damai.
One who gives produce to an innkeeper to prepare it for food, he must tithe what he gives to her and what he takes back from her, because she is suspected of exchanging it with her own produce.
Okay, let's stop there for just a second. Thank you. So what's going on here? Back in the times 2,000 years ago, there were no restaurants, or maybe there were, but it was very common that you would stop at an inn to have your breakfast or lunch or dinner, right? That was when you would go to an inn, you would not just eat there, you would sleep there too, because it would be on your journey. Think of it as a Motel 6, okay? So you stop at a Motel 6, but it's a bed and breakfast. Now, you are a Jew who's very careful about observing all of the rules. Are you going to have the cook with her own or his own food? No way. You don't trust them. What if they're using ingredients that are not tithed? So here's what you do. You come with your own food, not cooked food. And of course, there's a question of, well, what pots is the innkeeper using? Forget that question for a second. So you come with your own produce. You think you're going to have a salad. So you have your own lettuce, you have your own tomatoes, everything in a bag. And I'm giving it to the innkeeper to prepare my salad, right? Now, obviously, I have to tithe what I'm giving to her. That's obvious. I'm going to eat the food. It has to be tithed, okay? But this is what is surprising. It says you have to tithe it again when you get the salad back from her. Why? Why should I have to tithe it again? My salad's going to become very small. I keep having to give away my lettuce. What's going to be left at the end of the day? But why do I have to tithe it again? Because I can't see what she did in that kitchen. And innkeepers in the rabbinic mindset are not the most honest people on earth. So in their view, I'm going to go to Motel 6. I have my salad in my bag. I'm going to give it to the cook. I'm going to have tithed the produce so I know I can eat it. But then the cook is going to look at it and say, these tomatoes that Rabbi Grover gave me, they're much nicer than the tomatoes that I have in my fridge. I bet you he won't even know the difference once I cut them up between my tomatoes and his tomatoes. So you know what? I'm going to keep his tomatoes because I want to have those in my kitchen. And I'll cut up these ones that are a couple of days old and I'll put them in his salad. Does everyone understand what the problem is? So now I'm sitting at the table and I get back my salad and I'm eating tomatoes that were never tithed, right? Because I don't trust her that she tithed. She's an haaretz. So that's why there's an extra rule when it comes to the Mishnah that when I'm eating in an inn or I'm eating in a restaurant in somebody else's kitchen, I have to double tithe because I don't trust the innkeeper that he or she is serving me the same food that I gave her to prepare inside the kitchen. Is this a vote, Florence, for being able to, is it a vote for enmity or is it a vote for comity? Which one is it a vote for? I would actually submit that this is a vote for comity. It is a vote for being able to eat in a place where you're not entirely trusting of the chef and the food. Right? This Mishnah sounds strict, but it's actually, in my view, creating flexibility. You can go to a Motel 6 filled with people who don't know the rules of tithing and you don't trust them. But you can, as long as you take an extra step, right, that you wouldn't normally take if you were eating at a religious restaurant, right? If you were going to a kosher restaurant where you know there was COR supervision, you wouldn't have to take this step. But what the Mishnah is saying is, listen, you can't always find a kosher restaurant on the road. So there's a way that whereby they are enable the traveler to have a salad. It's going to cost you a little more because you got to separate the tithes twice, but you can have lunch. Right? Now, Florence, read the next line.
Rabbi Yossi said, "We are not responsible for deceivers. Rather, he must tithe only that which he takes from her."
We're not responsible for deceivers. Just take what he take. So what is Rabbi Yossi's view here? You should only tithe what he takes from her. If you tithe what he takes from me, right? I'm the customer. If I tithe what I take from her, then I know that I'm okay, right? I know that all the food I'm eating has been tithed properly. What is Rabbi Yossi's problem? Why should I care about tithing the produce that I'm going to give to her? What do you think, Florence? Why should I do it doubly? So think about this. This is the argument in the Mishnah. Remember, she's keeping my tomatoes. So I gave her a whole basket of beautiful produce. She switched the tomatoes. If she eats the tomato that I gave her, the nice one, and I didn't tithe it beforehand, who is guilty? Me or her? This is the interesting question, right? Rabbi Yossi says, we are not responsible for deceivers. What he's saying is, you don't have to tithe that tomato that you're giving her. She's a con. You don't need, she's switching it. This is her problem. So yeah, at the end of the day, she's going to eat your nice tomato and you didn't tithe it. But who cares? Let her be guilty. She never should have switched the tomatoes in the first place. But the way the Mishnah presents an argument, this is what's really interesting here. The way the Mishnah presents an argument is always says, this is the law, but here's somebody who disagrees. So the way this Mishnah is presented is, here is the law. You need to tithe that tomato before you give it to her, because you are responsible if she switches the tomatoes and eats the nice tomato that you gave her. That's why you have to do a double tithe. because even the food that she will switch and keep for herself, you gave that food to her. If you gave that food to her, you're giving her, think about it as non-kosher food. So let me take this scenario and make it into sort of a kosher, non-kosher thing. Now, by the way, I am not saying that this would work in a kosher, non-kosher scenario. Let's say I'm at my brother's house, and my brother is vegetarian. We'll make it easy. But that's not good enough for me. I need everything to be kosher. I don't really trust my brother. So we have an arrangement, me and my brother. I go to his house and I bring my own food. Here I bring my own food. I have all the ingredients, right? And he'll make it in his kitchen. And let's presume that I'm okay with that. If I bring him food that is not kosher, okay, it's my mistake. Am I responsible when he eats that food? Or is he responsible for not checking that it's kosher or not? Understand the question? Is the person responsible for kashrut the one who gives you the food? Now, by the way, Carmela and I have this argument a lot. So very, very often, we will get a gift that's not kosher, right? And I'm sure some of you who keep kosher, this happens to you a lot. Someone is just trying to be nice and they get you a gift basket or a bottle of wine, and it's not kosher. And so let's say it's a bottle of wine. Now, I can't drink it. Do I have to be careful? Let's say it's a beautiful bottle of wine, really expensive bottle, and I'm going over to my sister's house tomorrow. My sister drinks whatever wine she wants. She doesn't care about kosher wine. Am I permitted to give her that bottle of wine, which I know she would love, even though it's not a kosher bottle of wine? That's the argument that Rabbi Yossi is having with the Mishnah. Rabbi Yossi says you're not responsible for deceivers. In other words, don't worry about what the other person does with the food you bring them. You're only responsible for your food. I can bring my sister that bottle of wine. If she chooses to drink it, it's her problem. I'm not responsible for it. It's not an exact parallel scenario, but they're related questions that I think deal with the same theme. How careful must I be with my own food, and how careful must I be with the food that I serve to others? So that's what's really interesting about this Mishnah. Not only does it say, let's ignore Rabbi Yossi for a second. I know he disagrees, but the principle of this Mishnah is a Jew is not, an ideal Jew is not only responsible for tithing the food he eats, but also tithing the food he gives to others. So when I go to that restaurant, I need to make sure that every ingredient that I buy is kosher, even though I know I may not eat it, and somebody who's not observant is going to eat it. I still have to make sure everything is kosher. My tomatoes all have to be tithed. Twice. First, when I give it to her, so that when she switches it, she's going to eat tomatoes that are tithed. And when it comes back, so that I know that even the lousy tomatoes that she may have switched mine with are also tithed. Okay? That's Mishnah number 1. Now, another interesting one. Thank you, Florence. Myrna, you're next on my hit list. Are you able to read this next source for us? Here's another really interesting Mishnah about the mother-in-law. You thought there were problems with mothers-in-law only today. Turns out it's an old problem.
So one who gives produce to his mother-in-law to prepare it, he must tithe what he gives to her and what he takes back from her, because she is suspected of changing any food which is spoiled.
Now, here's what's interesting. So, same language, but different scenario. This example is closer to home, closer to what we're talking about, right? In our discussions here on this theme. How do you balance family and religious obligations? I have to go to my mother-in-law's house. My mother-in-law is an Am Haaretz. She's not a chaver. She's a wonderful person, but she is not in the club. She's just doing her best. In other words, we suspect what she's cooking is damai, perhaps untithed produce. And me, the son-in-law, I'm more religious. Does this problem sound familiar to anybody? So I'm more religious and I have to eat in my mother-in-law's house, right? So here, the Mishnah is imagining scenarios where you have to eat in unideal situations. The first unideal situation is you're traveling on the road and you have to eat in an inn. The second unideal situation is family. Because of family, sometimes we have to relax and ask for flexibility in our standards. What is the rule? Here, I have the opposite concern. This isn't a mean mother-in-law, it's a nice mother-in-law. So with the innkeeper, what was I worried about? That she was going to switch my bad tomatoes, that she was going to switch my good tomatoes for her bad tomatoes, because innkeepers need to make money, and that's what they do. But my mother-in-law has a different concern. She looks at my tomatoes and says, what did he buy this cheap tomatoes? These are terrible tomatoes. How can I serve this? He'll ruin my reputation. He'll tell all of his friends that his mother-in-law is a terrible chef. I don't want to insult him and tell him his tomatoes are terrible. And I don't want to get into a whole thing with him about what's, kosher and what's not kosher. So I have an idea, says my mother-in-law. I've got some really good tomatoes in my fridge. He won't know the difference. I'll take his cheap tomatoes and I'll throw them in the trash, or I'll keep them in my fridge. I'll use them for something else. And I'll give him my good tomatoes. And now I'll win over my son-in-law. I'll win over my daughter-in-law. They'll all say, oh, let's spend a lot more time at their mother-in-law's house because she's such a good cook. That's what the Mishnah is imagining. Folks, this is 2,500, 2,000 years old, something like that. Some things change, some things don't. The mother-in-law says, I'm going to make a really good meal, but I don't want to use the lousy ingredients my son-in-law brought, so I'll switch them and he won't know the difference. And the Mishnah says, you can assume that your mother-in-law is going to do that, and you can still eat in her home. How? Normally I would fear eating in her home because I'm afraid that the food she serves me, she's not going to allow me in her kitchen to supervise what she's doing. So I'm afraid usually that the food she gives me is non-tithed food. And I'm in trouble. But the Mishnah says, no. There's a way you can still eat in her house. What do? You do exactly what you did in the inn. When you give her the food, you have to tithe it. Just to make sure that if she switches any of the produce, like she takes my lousy tomatoes, now I know that if she eats that tomato at some later date, it's been tithed. So in other words, I can take that off my shoulders. I know that she's going to eat whatever food that I brought her that she switches. I know that it will be tithed when she eats it. She won't get in trouble. And for me, when she serves me my salad, I'm going to take 1/10 of the lettuce and tomatoes and I'll just hide them under the table, right? I'll wrap them in a bag and and put them in my coat quick so nobody sees. And I'll separate the tithe. I won't offend anybody. And that way I know that in case she switched any of the ingredients, I'm okay. I didn't eat any untithed produce. Again, it seems strict. It seems strict, but what the Mishnah is actually doing is allowing flexibility, encouraging flexibility to allow families in this example to eat together. Switch this scenario with kosher. I'm not saying the rabbis would say the same thing. I'm saying you could relate this story to issues of kashrut. Eating together is a value, so you should be flexible wherever you can be to keep the family together. Okay, Myrna, can you read what Rabbi Yehuda's rationale is?
Okay, Rabbi Yehuda said, she desires the welfare of her daughter and is ashamed of serving spoiled food to her son-in-law.
So that's his explanation. Rabbi Yehuda says she's doing it because, don't say she's doing it because of, how much she loves them. She's just ashamed to serve the food that her son-in-law brought because she wants her daughter to eat well and her son-in-law to eat well. So that's why she's switching the food. Now, keep going, Myrna.
Rabbi Yehuda agrees with the other sages that if one gives his mother-in-law seventh-year produce, she is not suspected of changing it and giving her daughter to eat of the 7-year produce.
Right. So what is the 7th-year produce? That is the Shemitah, the 7th-year produce. Are you allowed to eat Shemitah produce or not? Are you allowed to eat produce in the 7th year? Well, you can, right? It depends. If it's produce, let's say, from a non-Jewish farm. Remember, the Shemitah laws only apply to the land of Israel, produce from the land of Israel. So let's say this 7th-year produce is from, Iraq. I imported it. Or this 7th-year produce is from a non-Jewish farmer who has a farm in the land of Israel. Well, then I'm allowed to eat the Shemitah produce. By the way, that's what they do now in many places in Israel. They either sell the farm in the 7th year to a non-Jew, or they just import it from a different country. I mean, it's in Israel today. It's not like every 7th year there's no food. So there are ways to get around the rules. So it's the 7th year. I show up to my mother-in-law's house and I've got permitted 7th-year produce. Obviously, I'm a religious Jew. I'm not going to serve her forbidden produce. I've got permitted stuff. But what does she have in her kitchen? That's the question. My tomatoes are I imported them from Venezuela. Her tomatoes, I don't know where she got it from. Now, what if she switches my tomatoes with her tomatoes? That's not something you can tithe out. That's forbidden. I can't eat her tomatoes at all. So Rabbi Judah adds an interesting little piece here, which is, look, you might say that you can't eat at your mother's house every year on the 7th year. For the entire year, I'm not going to eat in my mother-in-law's house because I'm worried that she's getting stuff from her garden that she shouldn't be serving to a religious Jew. But Rabbi Yehuda says, well, she's not going to do it. Now, he doesn't say why. Why would she not do it? Presumably, well, like what I think the Mishnah is saying is, she wouldn't do it because she knows that her son-in-law and her daughter are more religious. And, it's one thing if it's a tomato that's really bad and she switches it with a better one, that to her is not a big deal. But she is not so careless to serve her, not just careless, but almost indifferent. She's not so indifferent to the observance of her daughter and son-in-law, where she would actually serve them forbidden food. Like food that you can't even separate a tithe from. Tomatoes that are completely not kosher. No mother-in-law would be that indifferent. This also adds a really interesting layer onto our discussion about how families get along with each other. Not only is the son-in-law motivated to make accommodations in order to eat at his mother-in-law's house, right? By separating the tithe, it's going to cost him a little bit, putting some of the produce, tithing it before and tithing it after. We understand that. But also, we are supposed to give credit to our hosts. They're not completely out to get us. Credit must be given to our hosts that they have some degree of caring about their guests' comfort level when it comes to their religious obligations, and therefore we can eat at their homes on the 7th year. We're going to be flexible and assume that they're not going to serve us forbidden produce. Does everyone understand that? That, in my mind, is a tremendous statement that we find in the Mishnah. Imagine a rabbi today saying, you can eat in your non-kosher family member's home because they know that they know not to serve you forbidden foods. Right? I don't know many rabbis that would say that. Instead, they would say, bring your boxed food yourself and eat there in the corner, and don't eat any of the food served in their kitchen. But that's not what the Mishnah says. It says, no, you eat at the table and you eat your mother-in-law's cooking. Even in the 7th year where you're suspected that maybe she's playing games with the produce and serving you stuff she shouldn't. No, you don't have to worry about that. Trust your mother-in-law. She will not do that. She knows the rules. She knows that you're more religious than her. You can trust her that she won't serve you forbidden food. I think this is a remarkable statement in the Mishnah that deserves to be highlighted and really chewed on as we think about the themes of this class, the theme that we're talking about in this class. Okay, thank you, Myrna. Okay, Fran, you are my next victim. Are you okay to read the next part of the Mishnah? Are you able to? There you go. Okay, I hear you now, Fran.
Okay. One who buys produce from someone who is not trustworthy in respect of tithes, and he forgot to tithe it, and he asked the seller on Shabbat if they were tithed. He may eat based on his word.
So in order to understand this Mishnah, thank you, Fran, you have to know that you cannot tithe produce on Shabbat. Some of you might know that among the 39 forbidden labors on Shabbat is separating. You can't separate on Shabbat from the different foods that you're making. It's one of the forbidden activities. And so let's say you're stuck with damai. You're stuck with produce that you got from an Am Haaretz, and it's Shabbat. And he gave you delicious tomatoes, and you really want to eat them on Shabbat, but you're suspecting that he did not separate the tithe properly. So he's my neighbor. I run to his house, and I say, did you tithe these tomatoes or not? And he says, yes, I did it. So, Fran, what's the law?
Okay. At
Can I-
nightfall
Well,
of
hold on. What's the law? Can I eat the tomatoes or not? If he says I tithed the produce,
yes,
can I eat them or not? Yes, I can
Yes.
eat the tomatoes. But
at nightfall of Shabbat, he may not eat of it unless he has first tithed it.
okay, so after Shabbat, then I have to separate the tithe. After Shabbat, I'm allowed to separate the tithe. So am I trusting this guy or not?
Sort of.
Sort of. Very good, Fran.
Yeah.
I'm sort of trusting him because I'm hungry and I really want these tomatoes and it's Shabbat and I need to eat something. So because it's Shabbos, I'm trusting him. But after Shabbos, I'm not trusting him. So actually what's going on, if you put it a different way, is the answer is no. You are not trusting him. In fact, he's called explicitly in the Mishnah someone who is not trustworthy in respect of tithes. But what is the accommodation here that the Mishnah is making? So the first one we looked at is the accommodation for the traveler who is stuck on the road and needs to have lunch. That's number one. And we make the accommodation. We say, just separate a couple of tithes and you're okay. The second accommodation is a situation where there's a family, part of the family that's not as religious as you are. They're Am Haaretz. So the accommodation, yes, you can eat in their home. You just have to separate a couple of tithes. Here, what is the accommodation? Why do I need to make it? It's not a restaurant. It's not a family member. It's the honor of Shabbat and my appetite. It's not nice on Shabbat to have no food. Shabbat is a day where you're supposed to have delicious food, plenty of food. That's part of the way we honor Shabbat is by having a beautiful spread. Am I going to leave these beautiful tomatoes on the counter and eat this, my lousy food that I didn't even have time to prepare when I have beautiful tomatoes there? No, that's disgracing Shabbat. So the accommodation in the Mishnah here is for the honor of Shabbat, and the honor of Shabbat involves my appetite being satisfied on Shabbat. And the Mishnah says, trust him. Sorta. Take him at his word. Shabbat is important enough that we can trust him. But after Shabbos, when you can separate the tithe again, then you should separate it because we don't really trust him. And now we have reasons to be strict. Do you see the balance, everybody, that the Mishnah is trying to strike? They're saying, look, when everything is ideal in your own little religious land, when you live in the bubble of religious behavior, you should be strict. But when you have to go out into the outside world, when you got to deal with regular people, comity, when you got to get along with people, when you have to have community, that's also a Jewish value. And in order to achieve that Jewish value, we are prepared to allow for flexibility that you would not be flexible with in your bubble. But outside the bubble, you can be flexible. And we've already looked now, this is the third case where the rabbis allow for flexibility for getting along with other people. Okay? So Fran,
Okay.
keep
If he
going.
could-
If he could not find the seller,
Yeah, if he could not find a seller or another person who was not trustworthy in respect of tithe,
and another person who was also not trustworthy.
say to him, they are untithed, they are tithed. He may eat of it at his word. At nightfall of Shabbat, he may not eat of it unless he had first.
Whoa, look at this. Thank you, friend. Look at this accommodation. So I run to my neighbor's house who gave me these tomatoes. He's not trusted in respect to time. I knock on the door. He's not there. Oh no, my God, I'm left with these tomatoes and I won't be able to eat them the whole Shabbos. They're going to go rotten. I'm not going to get to enjoy them. Shabbos is ruined. But I know this guy's friend. So I go to his door and I say, listen, Yankel, I got some tomatoes from your friend. Does he usually tithe or does he not tithe? Now, this guy that I'm asking, this third party, is also not trustworthy. And now I'm hearing it, it's like 2 steps removed. Not only is he also not trustworthy, he also doesn't know anything about these tomatoes that I got from this seller. So this third party says to me, yeah, he's trustworthy with regards to tithe. He tithes. Well, obviously he's going to say that. Who's going to say, no, who's going to badmouth their friend? So as long as he says, yeah, don't worry about it, he tithe them, this is a further allowance that the Mishnah is making. Not only can you eat the tomatoes on your friend's word on Shabbat, you can even eat them if you can't find your friend, but his friend tells you that you can eat them. Look at the flexibility here, expanding our ability to get along with each other as a community and not embarrass people for the sake of Shabbat and enjoying Shabbat. We're allowing for things that we normally would not allow for. And of course, after Shabbat, you have to separate the tithe because you're not really trusting this guy. You're just trusting him because you're in a pressing situation. Okay. Thank you, friend. Very good. Last one, and then we're going to go to discussion. Okay, last one. Abe, you're my next victim. I need you to unmute. Abe, you should see on your screen a button that says unmute. I know it's Shelly's computer, so. Shelly, can you give him a hand just to help him unmute? There we go. Okay, great. Thank you.
Of a vow orders his friend to eat with him, and the latter does not trust him with regard to tithes. The friend must eat with him during the first week, Shabbat.
Right.
The fact that he does not trust him with regard to tithes on condition that the host tells him that the food has been tithed.
So now we're going to look at the last situation of an accommodation. Okay. It says, by the way, week Shabbat, because the Hebrew says Bashabbat Harishona, and we don't know whether that means the first week or the first Shabbat. But let me break this down so that everyone understands the situation. For some reason, I'm stuck eating at my friend's house. Okay. It says under penalty of a vow. Maybe I lost a bet. It doesn't matter why, but I'm stuck eating at somebody's house who obviously, as it says, is not trusted with regards to tithes. So this is not somebody that I normally eat with. It's a special occasion. There's a special occasion and I have to eat because if I don't, I'm going to get in trouble. In this situation, it's because I made a vow, but you might even extend that to other situations where I'm forced to eat in a particular circumstance in a place where I would normally be very uncomfortable to eat. And what is the Mishnah's ruling with regard to a situation like that? The friend may eat during the first week, even though you don't trust him, as long as the person says, yeah, I tithed the food. So here, it's not the situation we just looked at of Shabbat being honored. It's fellowship being honored, right? So once in a while, I'm allowed to have fellowship with somebody who normally I would not eat with. Now you could say, why don't you just do what you did at the inn, which is take the tithe from the food that he gives you, right? So this is my friend's house. I go over. Why can't I just hide the food under the table and take the tithe at that point? Well, first of all, this could be on Shabbat, right? But let's say it isn't on Shabbat. What's going to happen to your relationship with that friend if that friend catches you taking some food out and he told you that he tithed already? What would what would that mean about your friendship? If somebody comes to your house and you say to him, listen, buddy, the food is kosher. I promise you the food is kosher. And your friend says, well, I don't trust you. What is that going to do to the relationship? So what I think, the way I interpret this Mishnah is, the Mishnah is trying to preserve a relationship here, and therefore does not prohibit you from eating at your friend's house or require you to take out a tithe, because that would be sort of an explicit questioning of your friend's honesty. Your friend told you he tithed the food. I know this friend isn't observant himself and doesn't usually take care of tithing, but he knew you were coming over. He told you he tithed the food. If you tithe it again, you're going to ruin your friendship. You're telling him, showing him, you don't trust him. How is that going to preserve a relationship? But Abe, read this next part.
But on the second week, even though he had vowed that he would not benefit from him, he may not eat with him unless he first tithed the produce.
So this is, I love these sources. You can tell I love these sources. Look at what it's saying here. The first week, you can eat with him. Trust him at his word that he tithed the produce. But on the second week and all the subsequent weeks, you need to have a conversation with him. You have to talk to him. You need to say to him, look, you're a nice guy and everything, but I just need to be true to myself. We have this rule in Judaism that says that if a person is not trustworthy in regard to tithes, I have to take 10% and separate it so that I can feel comfortable that I'm not eating food that I should not be eating. If your friend throws you out of the house at that point, so unfortunately, he's making a decision that his honor is more important to you than the relationship. And the relationship is done. But if you really have a strong relationship with this friend, then hopefully that friend will say, I understand completely. I get it. You have your truth, I have my truth. I value us being able to eat together. If what it's going to take for us to eat together in peace is for you to separate part of that tithe, if that's what it's going to take, so be it. We'll do it because I value this friendship more than I value my honor. What an amazing source this is, right? About how to navigate friendships and yet our personal preferences. The first time you go over to your friend's house, the first time, you want to keep it peaceful and nice. Don't make a stink. Don't raise, don't raise an issue. If your friend says, I took care of this for you, show him that you're willing to meet him or her halfway. Show him that you're prepared to be flexible. But after you have lunch together the first time, either you've built a relationship with each other or you have not. And if it's a real relationship, then by the second time you have lunch or dinner together, you should be able to have an honest conversation about your differences. I really like you. It's nothing personal, but I'm a chaver. And we have this rule when it comes to chaver that we have to separate a tithe even when your friend tells you that he already separated it, because you're living a lifestyle that just is not the same as mine. And does our friendship mean enough to you to be able to keep having these meals together, or does it not? And at that second week, you have to make a compromise. The second week we're going to be stricter, but the first week we can be flexible. So we've reviewed today, is that 4 or 5? 4 different Mishnahs in Tractate Demai that each talk about accommodating, how you accommodate. And you see why this is such an interesting tractate of the Mishnah to read about, because we're looking about different segments of society and how they get along with each other. And we're seeing the rabbis trying to make accommodations for the sake of communal harmony. Maybe if we are to take their advice and apply it to a modern context, we ought to be looking to make accommodations ourselves to keep these same principles: friendship, family, the Sabbath, the ability to travel. I mean, I can't tell you how many times people say to me, listen, can I be a little less strict? I'm flying to a place where there's no kosher restaurants. I mean, it's 2,000 years later, we have the same issues. And the rabbis say, yeah, you can find ways you can be a little bit less lenient in these circumstances so we can manage the challenges of life and still maintain a degree of loyalty to our tradition. Thank you, everyone. Those were the sources I wanted to review today. And we're going to stop the recording now. And you can turn on your cameras if you like, so we can have a discussion. You can